Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, over the years, I've seen numerous flat earthers bring up flight routes and flight diversions as apparent proof that the Earth can't be a globe, though these usually involve some serious misrepresentations or misunderstandings. But recently, I've found some new flights which look pretty interesting on a flat Earth, and not in a good way for flat Earth. Particularly a new flight out of China. But first, when people bring up flights that they claim debunk the globe, they usually fall into one of two categories. Either diverted flights.
You want to know what changed me to actually go back to the Bible, research, and believe in flat Earth? I looked into emergency landings. Something simple as that. That's what changed me.
What do you mean by emergency landing?
Like when say somebody's flying from Asia coming to LA,
they have to land
and like if it's an emergency or something,
Yeah.
and then see like the way they land, and then you gonna think like, wow, that's not an emergency land. They went all the way out the way, and then you got to break down why did they do that? Why they go all the way out the way, and they say it's an emergency landing. That's what changed my mind.
Or it's a route that starts and ends in countries in the southern hemisphere but has a stopover in the north, which they say makes more sense on an AE map. Now, sure, I know some flat earthers will say that they don't believe the AE map, but they won't provide an alternative map of the world that they think is accurate, and the fact is there are still plenty of flat earthers who do claim that the AE map is accurate. However, I've shown in a previous video a comparison where I took all of the flights occurring on Earth from Flight Radar 24 and I projected them as both a globe and an AE map and shown them side by side. And the globe routes are all following great circles as you would expect, but the AE map looks more like a merry-go-round. But flat earthers don't seem to want to look at all the flights, they only seem to want to focus on a few carefully cherry-picked ones that they can spin to fit their narrative. Which isn't really a fair way to do things. You should give people all the information so they can make an actual informed decision, much like today's sponsor Ground News. Ground News aims to remove the bias from media reporting. It's the brainchild of former NASA engineer Harleen Kaur, and it's a way of giving you all the information on a particular news story. For example, since we're talking about flight routes, Alaska Airlines have recently launched non-stop flights from Seattle to both London and Reykjavik. Currently, there are 36 news articles on the topic, and thanks to the help of multiple independent news monitoring services, I can see if any of these sources have any typical bias with their articles, that 86% of the sources have high factuality ratings. I can see a breakdown of who owns the sources, an insight section which gives a summary of the articles based on their bias, and I can filter the articles based on any and all of these before then selecting one and being taken straight to that original source. Check them out today by visiting groundnews.com/Dave M, and doing so will get you 40% off the Vantage plan which I'm currently using. So, when it comes to the flights that flat earthers claim debunk the globe, they'll sometimes bring up particular flights that perhaps had to divert to another airport. For example, I've seen mention of a flight that was going from, I believe it was Japan to California. It was certainly in those regions, and the flight made an emergency landing in Alaska, to which flat earthers will bring up a map of the world and say that Hawaii would have made more sense if the Earth was a globe, but that on an AE map, the flight would go closer to Alaska. Except the Mercator map is a distorted view of the globe. If you look at an actual globe and what is the shortest distance, i.e. a great circle route, you'll see that actually the flight path naturally goes close to Alaska anyway. The other type of flights that they try to bring up are instances where they look for flights going from one southern hemisphere country to another and then show that the flight includes a stopover in the northern hemisphere and that on an AE map it creates a straighter route than on a globe. Flat Earth Banjo loves showing these. For example, flights between South Africa to New Zealand, stopping in Dubai or Hong Kong, or flights from Sydney to Peru going via Los Angeles. However, you'll find with these flights, it's always with an airline that is based in the Northern Hemisphere. For example, when he looks at Auckland to Johannesburg, it's flying with Emirates, who are based in Dubai. And you'll notice that it's two completely different flights, EK449 and EK763. This is because airlines usually operate out of hub airports in their country of registration. If you look at British Airways, for example, all their flights seem to either originate or terminate in the UK. Flights from US airlines seem to originate and terminate in the US. Emirates fly all of their flights out of Dubai. So you're not really taking a flight from Auckland to Johannesburg. Emirates fly planes from Dubai to both Auckland and Johannesburg and back again. You're just catching a return flight from Auckland to Dubai and then changing to a completely different flight. Just like you would with changing trains, because they don't make train tracks that run between every single combination of town and city. The only flights that you could really use as a fair test for this are ones where you don't change plane. For example, British Airways have a flight, BA15, from Heathrow to Sydney that stops in Singapore. But both legs of that flight, Heathrow to Singapore and Singapore to Sydney, are both BA15. It's the same plane. Passengers aren't changing to a different flight, the plane is simply landing to refuel. But you'll notice in Banjo's example, he sorts the flights by price. Yet if I look for flights between those locations and I look for them based on duration, the shortest total journey time is still going via Singapore, but that's 26 hours total, including a 4.5 hour stop in Singapore. The next longest option is only 40 minutes longer in total, but with an almost 8-hour layover in Perth, Australia. So actual flying time is about 21.5 hours if you go via Singapore, but less than 19 hours if you go via Australia. And the issue with these flights for many years has been what airlines cover the routes. Given that most of the world's population live in the Northern Hemisphere, most of the major airlines are therefore based in the Northern Hemisphere, and most of the demand is to locations in the Northern Hemisphere rather than between locations based in the South. And the distances between the three main continents in the Southern Hemisphere limit such flights to large aircraft. Now, typically for a long time, the only sorts of aircraft with the ranges that could fly such routes were planes like the Boeing 747, the 777, the Airbus A340, the A380 and such. Basically, very large planes with large seating capacities, and for such planes to be financially economical for an airline, they had to be pretty full, but there just wasn't sufficient demand between the Southern Hemisphere countries to justify an airline in the South, like Qantas, buying such a plane and then flying it to other countries in the Southern Hemisphere, when they could instead use them on routes to the Northern Hemisphere where there's more demand. However, things have shifted in recent times, with airlines now favouring families of aircraft like the 787 and the A350, which focus more on being fuel efficient. So airlines can achieve long-range flights with smaller aircraft and don't need as many people on board for them to be profitable. And these are where it's really starting to show things up for Flat Earth. And things seem to only be going to get worse in the next sort of 12 months or so. For example, in December, I flew directly from Heathrow to Santiago, Chile on a 787. Now, the Great Circle route for this on a globe has the plane crossing the Atlantic and making landfall over Brazil, crossing between Bolivia and Paraguay before then reaching Chile. Whereas on an AE map, the most direct route crosses the Atlantic much closer to the Caribbean, making landfall near Venezuela and passing over Peru, which, shock horror, was not the route that our plane took. And for some strange reason, British Airways decided that the seatback screen that was going to show the progression of the flight was going to show the route on a globe. And it was indeed a Great Circle route that we were flying. But at the same time that I was taking that flight, fellow Flat Earth debunker Critical Think was also flying to Santiago, Chile, but instead was flying from Sydney, Australia. He even recorded his entire flight. And the routes for this one are even more different, because an AE map, the shortest route, is heading north across the equator over North America and Mexico, and down the entire western edge of South America. Whereas instead, his plane went further south and around New Zealand and circled round near Antarctica, which again is the same as a Great Circle route on a globe. And nowadays, there are a lot more flight options between the Southern Hemisphere countries. As you've just seen, you can fly with Qantas from Sydney, Australia to South America whilst remaining completely in the Southern Hemisphere. But they also have flights like QF63, which go from Sydney to Johannesburg, South Africa. And you can then drive across South Africa to Cape Town and catch South Africa Airlines flight SA226 to Sao Paulo, Brazil, which then puts you in South America, where you can travel across to Santiago, Chile, and catch the Qantas flight back to Sydney, Australia. So there are now flights available which will allow you to circle the entire Southern Hemisphere without ever crossing the equator. But now there's a few new flight routes that will soon be opening up, which I am very interested to see flat earthers explain. The first is a series of flights by Qantas as part of what they're calling Project Sunrise, which includes the first non-stop flights from Sydney to both Heathrow and New York. Currently, all options available either include a change of flight or a refueling stop. However, Qantas have purchased new Airbus A350-1000s that they're customizing to make these journeys, and they're expecting to receive them late next year. And again, the routes vary depending on the map, because on an AE map, the direct route between Sydney and Heathrow crosses over the very northern edge of Russia and north of Scandinavia. Whereas by comparison, the Great Circle route takes the plane over the Philippines, China, across Europe and south of Scandinavia. And the route from Sydney to New York on an AE map would cross Alaska and Canada, whereas the Globe would stay longer over the Pacific and cross the US by California. And even though the flights aren't due to begin commercially until 2027, Qantas have already flown these routes to test their feasibility. QF7879 flew on October the 18th, 2019 from Sydney to New York, and on the 14th of November from Sydney to Heathrow. And you guessed it, both tracked routes match the globe. However, those are not the flights that I am most looking forward to seeing. The one I'm most looking forward to is an upcoming flight by China Eastern from Shanghai to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, alone, this would be a very interesting flight because an AE map has the route going directly north, almost straight over the North Pole. And the globe could be very close to matching it, but it's not quite, because those two cities are almost antipodal to each other. As in, if you were in Shanghai and you were to tunnel straight through the globe, you would find yourself only about 400 kilometers north of Buenos Aires. If the flight destination was any further north than that, the shortest route would be going over the North Pole. If the destination was exactly antipodal, then the plane could fly in any direction it wanted because all directions would be the same distance around the globe. But with the destination being just south of antipodal, the Great Circle route has it going straight south over Antarctica. Though unfortunately this route is too long for even the longest range planes currently available to do non-stop. The route on the globe is almost 20,000 kilometers, i.e. half the circumference of the globe. But currently the longest ranged commercial aircrafts top out at just over 17,000 kilometers. So the flight is going to include a stop to refuel the plane before continuing. So, where will it stop? North America? Or Europe, perhaps? Nope. It's stopping in Auckland, New Zealand. Interestingly, on a globe, because the locations are so close to being antipodal, this doesn't impact the total distance that much. The shortest possible route between the locations on a globe is 19,639 kilometers. Going via New Zealand on the globe only adds about 100 kilometers more to the total journey length, whilst offering a refueling stop almost halfway. On an AE map by comparison, the flight route would be shorter just going straight from Shanghai to Buenos Aires because New Zealand is in the wrong direction. The distance on an AE map between Buenos Aires from Auckland is about 25% further than going from Shanghai. So it would make more sense for the airline to run 2 separate flights from Shanghai, one to Auckland and one to Argentina, and anybody who then wants to fly from Auckland to Buenos Aires could go via Shanghai. That would make far more financial sense for the airlines that, let's not forget, are all about the money. I remember a few years ago, Ryanair spent more than £100 million retrofitting small winglets onto their aircraft because it would reduce fuel consumption by about 1%, which eventually would pay for itself in reduced fuel costs. So if the Earth is flat, I highly doubt China Eastern are going to introduce a route like this that would hemorrhage money versus taking the shortest route on an AE map. And for anybody who wants to argue that the AE map is not their map, fine, what is? I'll be happy to put all the flight route data from Flight Radar 24 onto whatever map you like. Because so far, the globe seems to be the only layout of a world map that actually makes flight routes make sense. So, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks once again to Ground News for sponsoring it. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully, we'll see you in the next video.